you taking the time to be with me today.
Oh, sure. Yeah, happy to do it. It's a kind of a repeat experience. Where this kind of conversation used to happen was when I was at Southern Illinois University. I was the token qualitative person on the research committee of the graduate school that reviewed grants for funding, right?
Right.
And so I was forever translating statistical jargon into qualitative terms and vice versa.
Uh-huh.
So like they would get a qualitative paper, they could make no sense of it, and so I beforehand I would prepare kind of a translation, substituting all the main nouns for statistical terms,
Right.
and it became like a mini version of the United Nations for research.
Well, I'm sure that was probably an interesting part of your time there, right? For sure.
Yeah.
Now, what are you doing now? So I don't believe you're actively teaching now. Are you just reading and researching, or what are you involved with now?
Oh well, I retired about 10 years ago from teaching, but that really it was like all of a sudden getting an appointment as a research professor,
Right.
because I didn't have to stop doing what I love doing and go teach a class.
Right.
So now I just do what I do, which is read and write and publish. So
It looks like you've got a few books back there.
I this is the paradox of urban living. I have a library of about 5 or 6 thousand books,
Oh my gosh.
but I have the library is set up bookshelves kind of like right behind you,
Right.
but it's in a storage locker 2 blocks away.
Oh no.
So when when I'm working on a project, I bring the books and they get piled up in this little office I have at home.
Uh-huh.
And so when the paper is over, then I have a carload to take back.
Oh my gosh. Are you where are you? Are you living in and still in Illinois?
Oh no! I've been here in I have this is a condominium in Washington D.C.
Oh, okay. Okay, great.
Yeah, I'm on. It's a condominium that it was one of the early ones. I've been here about 12 years. I'm 4 blocks south of the Capitol building,
Oh my gosh.
5 blocks from the Library of
Right.
Congress. So
Wow.
it was this was a warehouse district by it's the district is called Navy Yard,
Uh-huh.
the Navy Yard metro station, and it was warehouses essentially belonging to the Navy, because I'm just 2 blocks from the Anacostia River where the
Right.
Navy had its docks, its loading docks.
Mm-hmm.
And so, of course, urban renewal came. All the warehouses were torn down. The Navy, except for a couple of buildings, moved out. And the result has been a surge of condominiums.
And that,
So there pretty much no empty lots now. But when I first moved here, it was like moving to Berlin after the war.
oh
My
yeah.
condominium building was literally in the middle of 12 empty blocks in all directions with just rubble where warehouse foundations were,
Right.
like they'd been bombed out or something.
Yeah. I
So,
uh I I was born in DC. My dad worked for AT&T there. He was supporting the Department of the Census. So he did telecommunications with AT&T and T and supported the Department of Census.
oh
And
yeah.
so we lived in suburban Maryland, but he worked in DC and I was born in DC. And he's still working. Now he works for the Department of Census doing telecommunications on the other end. So love the city, but didn't spend a lot of time there personally. But you're walking distance, right?
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
It's really a godsend in retirement, because I'm walking distance to Library of Congress, all the
Right.
museums.
Yep. Must.
So it's just an ideal location.
Yeah. Well, what are you working on currently then?
Well, basically, I have two genres. I write encyclopedia articles and
Uh-huh.
then just regular journal articles.
Okay.
And then probably once a year I volunteer to guest edit some journal.
Uh-huh.
So that's pretty much it. I totally abandoned the idea of publishing books because I reluctantly came to the conclusion that that belongs to the last century. That number one, nobody reads books anymore.
Right.
And the people who do need to read the books, graduate students, can't afford to buy books.
Right.
Average book run for an academic book now is 500 or less, which
Uh-huh.
means nobody's reading it, right?
Right.
So I've decided there were two things were important. One was to publish things that are legitimate. So that means publishing in a journal, which means publishing in a print journal, basically at this point,
Right.
which is also online. But to write articles, which covers the graduate student need, and to write encyclopedia entries, which covers the undergraduate need.
Mm-hmm.
So I really am audience focused on readers who will use the material.
Right. Which is so practical and so necessary, right? For sure.
Well, it's at one point I wrote an encyclopedia article that it was a reference set, but anyway, the article is the it's communication theories and models. This is
Mm-hmm.
the online title I've given it.
Mm-hmm.
It's technically about information theory, but it was the history of information theory. So, but anyway, that communication theories and models, I put that up on my academia edu page, and I think I'm up to about 10 or 12,000 reads.
Right.
Every student in the world reads that article.
Yeah. Well, I've noticed. So since we've been connected, I see a lot of papers that come through. It seems like you're up. How many articles would you say you've written in your career?
That's a hard one. I stopped counting after 125.
Okay. Yeah. So enough articles probably to fill multiple volumes of books. Have you ever considered like doing a compilation of all of your work or anything like that?
Yeah, actually I have a well that's another kind of media experience.
Right.
I have a good I've had a research connection with China for years. I was a Fulbright fellow there for a while, for a year, and then. But anyway, I had a Chinese colleague, very famous historian of semiotics, and he decided that he was going to publish his collected works. And he's European trained, and it's typical of, it's like the collected works of Kant or
Right.
Thomas Aquinas. So he wanted to do collected works, very, very natural academic attitude. So first of all, he couldn't find a publisher. Finally, after about 5 years, he found a publisher, and then they were only willing to print 200 copies. The story we already went through.
Right.
So at that point, I thought, collected works, it's a nice academic idea for the ego of the writer,
Right.
but absolutely pointless
Right.
as a communication vehicle.
For
So I
sure.
thought, okay. At the same time, I was an early participant in the academic edu setup and stuff.
Uh-huh.
Did a lot of consulting work with them, so that's the way to go.
Yep.
So academia edu and researchgate, I think, are the saviors of the world.
Right. Well, if you're getting 12,000 reads on a paper,
Yeah,
that is incredible. And it's just getting some of your work out there more widespread. And so I would just want to say to you, thank you for doing that. And really kind of maybe that's an entrance for us into what we're talking about today is the idea of
sure.
communicology, and some phenomenology and some of the stuff like that, I shared some questions with you. So maybe for the audience here, just give us basically, if you would, an entrance into, there's areas that you would say that you've written on: phenomenology, semiotic phenomenology, communicology, semiotics, All of those are very specific terms. So maybe you can just give us a grounding and an entrance, just so everyone knows what we're talking about as we're coming into this conversation.
Sure. I think the place to start is just with the word, the notion of communication. I'm one of those people in my formal education, BA through PhD, that started off in a speech department that became a speech communication department,
Mm-hmm.
that then became a communication department, and currently has renamed itself Communication Studies.
Right.
At the same time, that was happening in the United States. Then, about 5 or 6 years ago, the University of Hawaii decided that they would become a department of communicology.
Okay.
And they did it for a very specific reason. They wanted communication, the study of human communication, to be basically quantitative, statistically based research. And so
Mm-hmm.
they decided communicology would be it. And they posted an article saying so on Wikipedia. At the same time, in Europe, starting in the 1980s, that there was already a growing belief that semiotics, which is the study of sign systems, that was known as semiology. Uh, it was made scientific by the Americans who did not like the word semiology because it meant communication.
Mm-hmm.
So they used the word semiotics to give it a scientific flavor, right?
Okay.
Like economics,
Right.
semiotics.
Yep.
And so that tended to dominate in Europe as well. It became so semiotics became synonymous with communication. Well, the problem was that European universities were modernizing, and their study in European universities, the study of communication, what was the old-fashioned term called philology.
Mm-hmm.
Philology is the study of culture and language, communication,
Right.
much as we understand it. So philology was quickly going out of vogue as a term because nobody knew what that technically meant. So there were a lot of conversions of philology departments to semiotics departments.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the strange things that happens was that in the Soviet Union, as it was transitioning into becoming Russia, the universities decided that communication was a fundamental basic course, just like we teach English at our universities. And so semiotics became a required undergraduate course in the universities of the Soviet Union.
Russia. Mm-hmm.
That had an enormous impact on Eastern Europe, and uh, the perception of Eastern European countries, particular places like Romania and Poland, thought that it was too narrow. And so they decided, they came up with the term communicology. Now, where did they get that? They did a little research about the United States,
Right.
and they found out that back in the beginning of the 1960s and 70s, there was a big intellectual academic debate in this country when speech departments that taught what was called general speech, public speaking, rhetoric, and speech pathology and audiology decided to have the humanities science split. That
Mm-hmm.
the people in speech pathology and audiology wanted to be a therapy department,
Mm-hmm.
just like psychology would split from philosophy, for
Mm-hmm.
example.
Mm-hmm.
And so there was a great debate within the speech communication discipline about how the divide should take place. And there were people in the speech pathology and audiology section that said, this is a mistake to keep subdividing.
Right.
And they pointed to the fact that in the United States, when we go back to the early universities like Harvard, there were departments of rhetoric, which covered communication. They soon became split between speaking and writing. And so departments of English were born. Long story short, there were now departments of speech, public speaking, oral communication, and departments of writing.
Right.
But then it got kind of confused, like the philology thing, because the writing people were saying, well, that's just a skill. We have to study literature and writing.
Right.
So we moved forward up into the 1970s, and departments of English, which also contained linguistics, the linguistics people wanted to divide.
Right.
Okay, so this history of what happened in English departments, all this splitting, getting narrower and narrower and narrower, that was forefront in the great debate between speech pathology and rhetoric people in speech communication departments. So Franklin Knowles was famous for writing an article about, he proposed communicology for everybody.
Mm-hmm.
Communicology would be the science of communication with whatever subdivisions you wanted, which could be everything from film studies to speech pathology and audiology.
Mm-hmm.
He didn't win.
He lost.
It was rejected. However, back to Europe now. The Europeans are looking at the history of all of this. They said, that's it.
That's it.
Communicology. Why communicology? Well, because Europe is just coming off of 150 years of a debate about a discipline called sociology.
Right.
Oh, sociology was the outrage of its time. Why? Well, because up until that point in European history, all academic disciplines had been defined by Greek terms.
Mm-hmm.
And sociology, socius, logos. Oh, that's Latin, not Greek.
Right.
You can't do that. Only Greek terms, none of this Latin stuff. So it was an outrageous controversy for 100 years.
Yeah.
Finally accepted. So communicology. Again, Latin communis, logos, another Latin Greek
Latin
term,
Greek
another
term.
heresy.
Yeah.
However, for the Europeans, we found out that original heresy was nonsense. Forget it. We're going to go with communicology.
It was accepted.
Why? Because all true science is any systematic study. So the Europeans believe that universities are science operations.
Mm-hmm.
Even literature is a science. Systematic study is science. So universities do science. So communicology, single term for the study of communication.
Mm-hmm.
So
Okay.
we reach a saturation point. So in 2000, I held a conference at Southern Illinois University and said, now's the time to reintroduce Knowles terms.
Right.
We've been through this whole analysis in America and Europe. Time for a one-term science term for the discipline. However, back to the University of Hawaii now. They said, oh, no, it's got to be quantitative. So along comes my group, says, well, no, it can be quantitative. That's true. But let's keep the qualitative in there. So we took the philosophic position.
Okay.
Which is to say, if you're going to look at the essence of the study of communication, what is the absolute thing you need? Human beings. Human beings are the point of view in all of this. Mm-hmm. So communication's got to be a human science. And what does this study? It studies how human beings communicate. And the general name for that is discourse. So, definition, communicology is the human science of discourse.
Okay.
Quite simple, a one-liner. However, unlike limiting it to a quantitative method, we say communicology is the human science of discourse using the methodology of logic. Mm-hmm. Because logic governs all disciplines. Mm-hmm. Doesn't matter what they are, fine arts, music, physics. Mm-hmm. Human beings involved have a discourse, a systematic discourse, and they have a method, and it might be mathematics, but logic and mathematics in its pure form, going back to the Greeks, is one system.
Mm-hmm.
There's no difference between math and logic.
Right.
And so we use the principles of logic, and then this makes a direct connection then into things like phenomenology and semiotics, because what you do is when you study the history of philosophy, you can look at any major philosopher and you just have to ask two questions: what is their theory of logic, and how do they tie that theory of logic to language?
Mm-hmm.
Right away, you have their definition of what communication is.
Right.
And so that's pretty much what's involved. So that then leaves the question of communicology favoring the method of semiotic phenomenology. So two parts.
Right.
Semiotics is the logic of any kind of system, any kind of pattern.
Right.
Communication people are fond of saying we study patterns,
Okay.
patterns of interaction, patterns of language, patterns of vision, so on. So semiotics is the relationships. The word that semioticians like to use is structure, but that
Uh-huh.
just means relationship.
Right.
Relationship. Or if you really want to talk things like communication theory, the word that for structure and relation is code.
Right.
So so semiotics is the study of codes.
Code.
How does anything get coded? On the other hand, the phenomenology then is that phenomena means things. Phenomena plus logos, the logic of things.
Mm-hmm.
How do you perceive things? How do you know about anything?
Right.
So the phenomenologists are famous for critiquing positive science by saying you can't pretend there's no observer.
Mm-hmm.
You can't say there are things like pure sensation or pure perception.
Mm-hmm.
Somebody's got to be doing it.
Right.
And if somebody's doing it, you have to account for how they're doing it.
Right.
So phenomenology always says, look, start with the human point of view. So
Mm-hmm.
almost invariably, that then has a very simple practical problem. It's perception.
Mm-hmm.
If you're going to study anything, the first question you ask yourself is, how am I perceiving it? The next question is, how do you express it? I
Mm-hmm.
perceive something and I want to translate that into language or film or image or imagination. What's the form of expression?
Mm-hmm.
So usually in my research, the simple comparison that I draw, particularly for students, is that we forget that we're the perceiving human being, and because we do that, what we do is we encounter the world, we encounter expressions. Everything is expressing to us. The natural world is a visual kind of expression to us. Other people talk to us, so on. And we forget that that's very familiar to us. And so one of the questions becomes, why do we forget that?
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's because we're adults. We forget that we were born into the world and we had to learn all of this.
Right.
We were perceiving all the time. We were perceiving the sound of mom's voice, dad's voice. We were learning to discriminate sounds. And not only that, we were being introduced to the agony of education, because one of the first agonies the family gave us was baby talk.
Right.
Here we are trying to figure out what language these people are talking.
Yeah.
We're trying to perceive their language, and they're screwing around with all the phonology,
Right.
messing it up, elongating it, and it takes a long time to sort through all of that.
Right.
So one of my recommendations to my students is that when you get married and have kids, please just talk to them like normal people.
Just talk to
No,
them
no,
normal.
no baby talk. Make
Right.
it easy on your
Make
kids.
it easy on the kids for sure. I wish you would have told me that 15, 20 years ago. Right.
Well, and then the same thing comes then. I do a lot of cross-cultural consulting. So the other thing I say is that if there are two languages in the family, stay with one language for one event.
Right.
So in my family, my wife is Chinese.
Uh-huh.
My primary second language is French, and then Spanish, little German. But I was also raised in New Mexico, so I have a functional ability in the Diné language, the language of Navajo Indians.
Oh my goodness.
So now there's a reason for my background, because I learned a little Diné. It's a tonal language, just like Chinese.
Uh-huh.
So I ended up marrying a Chinese woman because her manner of speaking is very familiar to my ear.
Okay.
I can understand her emotions much better than I can just a standard American.
Yeah, yeah. Are you able to speak Chinese then? Have you learned that, I'm sure, a little bit, or
No, well, that's it. My perception is quite good.
uh-huh.
Uh, my expression is highly limited
Right.
because I'm not used to, it's like Diné. I haven't spoken Diné in 20 years.
Right.
There's no call for it. But the problem is that tonal languages, your meaning shifts by your tone of voice.
Mm-hmm.
And to this is a totally unfamiliar concept to most Westerners.
Right.
The closest analogy I've ever come up with is uh, the analogy with forms of sentences.
Mm-hmm.
We use tone to distinguish between a statement and, like, a question.
Right.
I'm making a statement. I'm making a statement. Oh, yeah, we can tell the difference between those
Right.
two. The
Right.
tone shift.
Yep.
So we pick out sentence types by
Mm-hmm.
tone, but in tonal languages, the people pick out words by tone.
Mm-hmm.
So they're making a much more refined selection
Mm-hmm.
than we would. So generally, when I'm in a group of Chinese, I can perceive when I'm being talked about and how I'm being talked about, although I can't respond.
Right. Right. Yeah, exactly. Um, so communicology, just refreshing me because I'm just coming into it, is
Sure.
a science, a human science for the study of discourse, a human science of the study of discourse, which is the interaction between people. Correct? Is that
Right.
fair? Right.
Oh, sure, sure.
From a from a phenomenological method. In other words, you come into it not from that positive science where there's something, you're always coming to it from the understanding that there is a perspective that somebody's taking on whatever the expression may be.
Oh, exactly. Which
Right.
is, you see, I think this makes it incredibly practical and commonsensical, because when we talk with somebody else, we're totally focused on the perspective that I have of the other person.
Right.
I'm looking at them as a human being who has all kinds of characteristics, and I know they are too. And so when we, or if we're going to describe our conversation, our dialogue, we have to account for those kinds of perspectives. And so I use a number of simple comparisons, which I'll do in just a minute. But the principle involved here is the old Greek concept of analogy. When Aristotle talked about rhetoric, he said it's nothing but a game of analogies.
Mm-hmm.
I make an analogy to when I hear you talking. I make an analogy between what you're saying and what I would have said.
Right.
When I listen, I'm making an analogy to the way I would listen,
Right.
and I assume by analogy you listen the same way I do.
I
Of course,
hope.
that's the beginning of the problem, right?
Right.
It's only an analogy. It's not a
Right.
match,
Right.
and so we get a lot of things wrong. We have to work at it. Okay, so the one of the simple examples to do this is positive science models of communication, sender, receiver, transmission, that sort of stuff. These all toss away the notion of analogy. They toss away the notion of context. So when we talk about things like a communication code, the first thing that we forget is that that's just a gross general abstraction. There is no thing called the code. What there is a interpersonal relationship, a process of coding. It's always I always say this is the ing rule. If you want to really describe anything, always put ing on your main verbs and nouns, and you'll get the flavor of process.
Right.
So if there's no thing called the code, what is there? Well, there's what we'll stay with the language. There's encoding when you do it.
Mm-hmm.
There's decoding when I receive it. So encoding is a speaker phenomena. Decoding is a listener phenomena.
Mm-hmm.
Now the thing is about that analogy is that we know something that's very commonsensical, predictable about this, namely that they're opposites. That whatever is this encoding, it's the decoding is the mirror reversal, the
Right.
mirror opposite of it. So if we talk in just plain English, as Charles Peirce liked to talk about it, what is encoding? Encoding is simply intelligibility.
Mm-hmm.
When I talk, I want to make myself intelligible. So I try to pick out the words and sentences. I try to have the emotion that goes with that. So I'm working on making things intelligible to the other person.
Mm-hmm.
But now, so we flip that over in the mirror, and what's the listener doing? Well, the listener, yeah, has to work on intelligibility, and so that's a matchup of language. I listen to you. Oh yeah, you're speaking English. Yeah, I recognize you're nonverbal and so on. So no problem there. So what am I doing as a listener? Oh well, I'm doing that analogy to myself again. So my first question is, why is this relevant?
Right.
So speaker point of view, let's make it intelligible.
Mm-hmm.
Listener point of view, let's make it relevant. So it's matching. And intelligibility and relevance are generally opposite.
Right.
You see that the more I demand relevance, the less intelligible you become. You're not me talking. That's the
Right.
problem.
Yeah. One of the things that I found, and maybe you can comment on it, is the more I study or learn about communication and language and abstraction, the more challenging the question is: how in the world is it the fact that we actually communicate with other people and can understand what's going on? It's just seemingly like miraculous to me that these abstract words, and maybe that's where semiotics come into it with sign and signifier and all that stuff, that we're able to, like, how are we able to really understand what people are saying? How are we able to get meaning out of that? And how does that whole process work, maybe from a communicology perspective?
Yeah. Well, it's yeah. We on the surface, it would appear to be a minor miracle that we communicate at all,
Right.
given all of the differences that are involved. But again, this is where philosophy comes into the picture. The you kind of have to go back to the fundamentals of the Greeks, because the Greeks really got everything right, particularly Aristotle.
Mm-hmm.
Aristotle wrote a little essay that is kind of like an introduction to his logic treatises, but it's called Hermeneutikos. And it's on hermeneutics. Hermeneutics is interpretation. So Aristotle is saying, look, but before I talk about logic,
Mm-hmm.
all the technicalities of how analogy works, before I
Mm-hmm.
talk about that, let's deal with the human point of view, which is interpretation. We're going to interpret things,
Mm-hmm.
and so how does interpretation work? And he has a one liner. It opens the essay. He says, thinking leads to speaking. Speaking leads to writing. It
Mm-hmm.
happens that way.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, that's great, except that's only an account of encoding. That's Aristotle the adult saying, yeah, I think about things,
Mm-hmm.
I say it, and then I write it down.
Mm-hmm.
But what did little Aristotle do when he was learning to speak Greek? Well, he encountered the mirror.
Mm-hmm.
He encountered writing first. He encountered his parents who were inscribing. They were talking a language.
Mm-hmm.
He had to listen to that. He took those inscriptions, those signs. He had to turn them into signifiers. He had to express them. So little Aristotle played around with the sounds until he got all the vowels and consonants down. And then it's what most Westerners call the age of reason, the moment of reason. About age 7, this happens. Suddenly we discover thinking. And
Mm-hmm.
what is that? This is the grand code, if you like, the grand matrix of logic, which is little Aristotle discovered that not only could he differentiate between the parents talking to him and him talking to the parents, little Aristotle discovered he could tell the difference between inside him thinking quietly, no sounds, and
Mm-hmm.
the outside of him speaking, making sounds.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, that's the grand analogy. What's happening inside, outside me is happening inside, outside mom and dad.
Mm-hmm.
We share that matrix.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is often called quadrature, quadratics, four. And it's the system of analogy that Aristotle invented for logic. And that pattern, and Aristotle just systematized it. It goes back much further to people like Pythagoras and Parmenides, the ancient Greeks that we don't know much about. And so the idea is that there are four of everything, and these become the famous four causes of Aristotle. But
Right.
you'll find them. They're the four basic categories. Philosophers talk about categories.
Mm-hmm.
That too is misleading because a category, again, is just a relationship, a
Mm-hmm.
rule.
Mm-hmm.
And the great proof of this is that you can ask any apparently educated person what a rule is, and they can't tell you
Right.
because the rule is quadrature. Rules are whatever relationship we pick out of the four possibilities.
Mm-hmm.
So we talk about rules all the time, but we don't know what they are. They're just accepted analogies that we like to use.
Mm-hmm. What explain those four possibilities that you just mentioned?
Yeah, well, I don't want to do that because it gets into metaphysical terminology, and there are nice accounts of it, and anybody can look up Aristotle's four causes on Wikipedia.
Okay.
You'll get nice charts and easy. But the main thing to keep in mind is that the four causes are Aristotle's version of what Pythagoras called common notions. And what are some of the common notions? Pythagoras says, look, um, human experience is differentiation. How do you decide how something is the same or different?
Right.
And the so there's I'm giving you the four causes in a different form.
Okay.
So you try to differentiate things, and the first thing that you differentiate is that this is natural science. This is your typical scientist.
Mm-hmm.
The first thing you differentiate, you look into the world of nature and you say, some of the things are the same and some things are different.
Mm-hmm.
I I see a chicken. Oh, well, I'm different from the chicken. On the other hand, we're the same. We're both living organisms. We both eat and die. Oh, well, whole bunch of similarities and differences.
Mm-hmm.
But I put all that together. There's an analogy there of the
Mm-hmm.
same and different. But that gives me a rule for what's an animal and what's human.
Right.
But it's synergistic. It gives me a whole bunch of secondary rules like what's alive and what's dead,
Mm-hmm.
what has feathers, what doesn't, so on. So same and different. And then that's the adult speaking. Well, I'm busy making same and different comparisons. Where did that come from? Oh, it came from a different earlier analogy, a different earlier differentiation. That was between self and other,
Mm-hmm.
me and you.
Mm-hmm.
Ah, yeah, me and mom. That was the
Right.
first differentiation. And then once I discovered me and mom, I discovered inside me and outside me.
Right.
That's the quadrature. Self, other, same, different. Those four elements are the basis of every rule, every analogy, and we call that being human.
Mm-hmm.
And why is that important? Because a machine can't do it.
Right.
There's no logic on earth that can make that logic work because we have a very special thinking ability which is that rule making ability in the first place. And it's all based on the self-awareness I have. Self-awareness because of awareness of the other, self-awareness because I'm the same and different than other people. And that whole ability to differentiate means that the thing that I'm doing that a computer can simulate but not originate is that I have memory.
Mm-hmm.
I have consciousness, not I have a mind, not
Mm-hmm.
just a brain,
Mm-hmm.
but the operation of that brain, the consciousness, the process of that brain functions with. So what does my memory do? Something very important, which is going to be now the basis between the differentiation between information and communication. So
Mm-hmm.
what's my brain doing? My brain, my memory is recording all the decisions that I make.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, most people would call this their good memories. What are your good memories? Well, they're most of your memories.
Right.
You keep the good ones and you get rid of the bad ones. You
Mm-hmm.
try to anyway. That's Freud's repression. That's how you try to get rid of them, but they're not gone. But it's the good ones. So when you come home for Thanksgiving dinner and meet the family, you've got all your good memories and they've got all their good memories, but they don't match.
Mm-hmm.
Their good memories are generally at your expense. They remember things you got wrong. They were
Right.
funny.
Right.
You remember them as tragedies. You
Mm-hmm.
tried to forget them. That's why Thanksgiving is such a contentious period for most families because all of a sudden the history of memory comes into dialogue where it's usually silent, and we're
Mm-hmm.
much better off in that moment with the silence. Okay, so we have the good memories, but we have the bad memories. Well, that tells you something about human memory versus machine memory. Human memory remembers the decision made. I remember all the decisions I've made, and that's the important part. And then I remember the evaluation I made.
Mm-hmm.
I remember whether they were good or bad. I've got two categories. Okay, now why is that important? Because this is a special kind of human logic. It's combinatory, it's both and.
Mm-hmm.
We always make the analogy between things. We combine in order to then differentiate. So this is usually just shorthanded as a both and logic, this combining power. The memories that are bad that I don't want to remember, I'm excluding, but they're still there.
Right.
And why do human beings keep them? Why do we have them lurking there? Well, it's because we might need them in the future.
Right.
We realize that any decision we make is contextual. It's bound to that situation. So if the situation changes, my judgment might change. Okay, well, human beings discovered this a long time ago. This is very important. And so we institutionalize it. We call it education.
Mm-hmm.
We teach our kids what all the good choices are,
Right.
knowing that they'll make some good choices and some bad choices, and they'll remember both of them.
Right.
And that's important because we're exposed to, we're confronted with other people's decisions. Some are the same, they're good. Some are not the same, they're bad. So we experience all this. That's what socialization is. So when we look at this philosophically, what does that mean? It means that we've developed a very sophisticated logic, which is combining and dividing and doing both at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why I can make a choice, yet change my mind.
Mm-hmm.
I can do exactly the opposite and be happy with it.
Mm-hmm.
And you can be happy with my decision because you would say, if you were a parent, oh, look, kid, you learned something.
Right.
You learned that what a mistake is. You
Mm-hmm.
learned what an error is. And so this, has enormous ramifications for public policy, but especially in education. Kids have to be in situations where they both learn to succeed and fail.
Mm-hmm.
If there's no failure, there's no learning.
Mm-hmm.
So that the whole idea that is, it's sometimes critiqued these days as meritocracy, a bad thing. No, merit judgments are very important
Mm-hmm.
because you've got to be Greek. You already know you're in the evaluation business.
Mm-hmm.
You must know how you're evaluating, and you must have an analog scale that is mostly good, mostly bad, but you also have to have the ability to switch those around when you need to.
Mm-hmm.
And then you get into the collective business of what should most people be doing, and that's where the Greeks were very, very fond of rhetoric and the court system and laws because they said sometimes people just can't figure this out on their own and they have to have help. And that's what the Greeks invented the judicial system, law courts for that, which was
Mm-hmm.
the place where rhetoric was born.
Mm-hmm.
And so judgments have to be made, and so this is where we get our Western value of, first of all, where we started. Everything I've said so far was a great explication of what common sense is.
Right.
We commonly hold that things are sensible this way.
Mm-hmm.
Now we take it up to the next level of evaluation by saying common sense must be in the context of the common good.
Right.
And so this is what the Greeks believed, that the common good is achieved by good people. Good people are produced by systems where they are exposed to getting it right and getting it wrong
Mm-hmm.
and taught that they can change their mind.
Right.
No machine can do that.
Yeah.
No
So
animal can do that.
in I think that's a very interesting thing to explore because there are the technophiles out there, the artificial intelligence defenders that believe that someday computers are going to think better than human beings. I do believe also, I read much of Richard Dreyfuss and listened to him, specifically his commentaries on Heidegger's being in time and the phenomenological perspective on computers and theory of mind and thinking and everything like that. I'm assuming that you're going to say there's never going to be ever any chance that a computer will be able to replicate a human in actuality. It may be able to simulate certain thoughts and things like that, and maybe fool somebody in that Turing test into believing it's a human, but you don't believe that they are the same qualitatively when it comes to those thoughts, no matter what type of neural networks or artificial neural networks that, computer scientists or something like that can come up with. Is that fair?
Oh yeah, yeah. No, I would agree with that because I have a much simpler way of going about it
Right.
than having to invoke uh, philosophic metaphysics.
Right.
you if you if we take the point of view of common sense, okay, computers they get better every year. The software gets better every year. But the fundamental question you've got to ask yourself now is, where did the computer come from?
Mm-hmm.
A human being built it.
Mm-hmm.
So that's number one, the origin problem. It's
Mm-hmm.
always built by a human being. Well, then the counter argument usually is, well, when the machines get sophisticated, they'll replicate themselves. That's true.
Mm-hmm.
You can have a robot build a better car than a human being can build a better car.
Mm-hmm.
But there's the secondary question. Machines are notorious for wearing out.
Mm-hmm.
They do have time spans, just like human beings.
Mm-hmm.
Anybody who owns a computer knows that.
Right.
It's called emptying the garbage,
Mm-hmm.
because what are computers are mechanical simulations of memory,
Mm-hmm.
choices I made and choices I didn't. But
Mm-hmm.
those are all in the computer memory.
Mm-hmm.
And the choices I didn't make are the garbage that has to be emptied in order
Right.
to save space in the memory.
Right.
Now, the one solution to that is to expand the memory.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, the cloud. Common sense. Where's the cloud? Well, it's taking more and more and more acres
Mm-hmm.
of circuit farms to
Mm-hmm.
hold the memory, because nobody wants to lose any data,
Right.
not even the stuff that's not saved for any particular purpose.
Right.
So yeah, everything was ever on any computer is there someplace.
It's there.
But my God, is that a storage problem?
Mm-hmm.
There are two ways to go with that. More memory farms, that's one, we're building them,
Right.
or increase the capacity of the chip, make it smaller and more data. And
Right.
we're doing that too. So the very latest uh, computers are the attempt to build chips that do what they describe as something really amazing. A chip that will remember yes and no and yes and no together.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I think that's where we started with the human being.
Right.
They were together and then we divided them. So
Mm-hmm.
machines are at the level, of a simple organism. Machines have same and different.
Mm-hmm.
They want to try and find an analogy for self and other
Right.
that matches same and different, and they will be able to do that. But it's not going to be self and other.
Right.
It's going to be same and different, and oh, same and different. It's
Right.
always going to be binary,
Yep.
and it's always going to be a good choice, and there's always going to be the garbage no choice in memory. Empty the garbage.
Mm-hmm.
So common sense, what does that mean? It means human beings have to build the machines, but human beings have to maintain the machines.
Mm-hmm.
They can't repair themselves. There's no computer in the world that can go on functioning without you emptying the garbage.
Right.
There's no mechanism that will allow the computer to self-empty its garbage.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we empty that out, just part of our natural thinking process.
Without even thinking that it's part of the process.
Right. It just automatically happens. Those things disappear that we say no on or we think are not important or whatever. But however, there's still remnants of it that are left there to a certain extent. Fair?
And they still, yes, and they still cause problems. That's what a quote bug is.
Right.
Let me give you the human version of that. You and your partner, wife, partner, whatever, you have an argument.
Right.
You say things that are on your mind, not filtered. They hurt.
Yep.
They hurt just as much as the good stuff you used to say that felt really good.
Right.
They hurt. They hurt so much that you get into a Rousseau social contract. You both agree never to say it again.
Right.
Yeah, yeah. You smile as you
Yeah,
say that
I
because
know.
you know that agreement is quite facile.
Right.
It's so time goes by, another incident happens, and spontaneously, this is why Freud had such a good business. Spontaneously, you say the thing that's never to be said again.
Hmm.
You've changed your mind and you've pulled it out of memory.
Hmm.
The bad that was assigned to the good, never to be said again box is now out of the good box back into the bad box.
Right. And then you've got now you've got problems in the practical
Exactly.
world.
So what is it? But what's the analogy? Just to be sure, we said that all the stuff that was in garbage was deleted.
Right.
It was, except the machine still had to save one little thing,
Right.
the rule to empty the garbage.
Right.
That's still in the algorithm code.
Yeah.
And because it's there, it can be recovered.
Uh-huh.
And the FBI and the CIA are very good at recovering it.
Right.
Just like we're very good at picking that one word out and saying it again.
Yeah. Uh super super interesting. Um can you take us a little bit into the different schools? You talk in one of you, I've read your article, encyclopedia article on phenomenology, I believe. And can you take us through maybe the history of the different schools, the differentiations between those schools, be it entrances or methodologies or whatever, and into kind of semiotic phenomenology, which is kind of one of your areas of expertise. I would say you've written on quite a bit, and give an understanding of how that works and why that's important in communicology.
Okay. Well, let's. I think that the interesting approach for that is to just deal a little bit with the history of phenomenology.
Sure.
Um, Basically, phenomenology is a term that kind of comes out of Immanuel Kant's work, which we don't need to worry too much about. Basically, he Kantian philosophy is about focusing on human reasoning.
Hmm.
Kant was very much interested in the mind and consciousness and basically how people make judgments.
Hmm.
And so that's really where the term comes from. However, the actual kind of application of that thinking starts with it originates again out of the German philosophy, but it originates with Franz Brentano. Brentano was one of the early people who was focused on what we call psychology.
Hmm.
So there has been a traditional interdisciplinary fight in the academic world between philosophy and psychology.
Hmm.
Are they the same, the different? And everybody goes to great pains to differentiate them.
Right.
The problem being, as have already understood, is that the two things that are being studied are already together, and so the attempt to divide them is based on the fact that they do have lots of compatibilities.
Right.
But the simple version is psychology is concerned with the thinking part, the mind, consciousness. How are you consciousness of things? So Brentano was an early proponent of psychology. Now, Brentano's work is not particularly spectacular. He was just asking a lot of questions, but he is famous because he had at the same time two very famous students. One, Sigmund Freud,
Mhm.
right? Freud was really interested in how does the mind work from the point of view of how does the mind know itself?
Mhm.
It's the problem of self-awareness, but not the self-awareness of a whole human being. How does my mind know my body? Now, Freud wanted to go inside and say, well, what's conscious? Where does it come from?
Right.
How does the mind know itself? So that's the whole Freudian school of psychology, which ultimately becomes what we call psychiatry.
Mm-hmm.
The other student was Edmund Husserl. Same problem, consciousness, but Husserl was more the scientist. He said, how are we conscious of things?
Mm-hmm.
We'll assume the mind is consciousness and it knows itself. How does it know things?
Mm-hmm.
So those two people represent the great divide, but still within the context of what is consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
So it's Husserl that becomes important to us on the human science end, because that's more the philosophical side. It's the metaphysical side. It's the concern with people and things.
Mm-hmm.
So Husserl develops his phenomenological method, which is nothing spectacular. He's just reinventing Aristotle. Husserl says, look, the mind goes through an analogy process of thinking, speaking, and writing.
Mm-hmm.
Things in the world are like writing. They're
Mm-hmm.
inscriptions. They're products. They're end products.
Mm-hmm.
So Husserl's concern with phenomenology was backtracking from things into speaking. So the others are concerned with language, but language is still a symbolic system. So what's behind the symbolic system? Well, it's thought. So the Husserl question becomes, how does the mind make objects for itself? And we know this as subject and object.
Right.
So there's a subjective and an objective, and his whole exploration was in those terms. Okay, so what happens then in the history is that you basically get two schools, the German school and the French school.
Mm-hmm.
The German school stays with Husserl, and ultimately we get Heidegger, where the whole concern is, how does consciousness know itself? In the French school, we have the intrusion of the life sciences, psychology, sociology, especially anthropology. So the focal person becomes Merleau-Ponty. Merleau-Ponty says, yeah, consciousness is a problem, but what is the main object that consciousness has? Well, it's our own body.
Mm-hmm.
Our consciousness, and this is where we get people like Piaget, for example, where you explore how does the child's consciousness get embodied or become physical behavior.
Mm-hmm.
And just footnote here, Piaget was the person who succeeded Merleau-Ponty at the Sorbonne, the chair of child psychology. So
Mm-hmm.
Piaget continues on what Merleau-Ponty began.
Mm-hmm.
So Merleau-Ponty is the philosopher, and his famous book, Phenomenology of Perception, is all about the domain of perception. And his argument is quite simple. It's just like my argument that you've got to have a human being to build a computer and to maintain a computer. Merleau-Ponty says, look, you got to have a body to have consciousness.
Right.
You're just not going to have a thing called mind and its function without a body.
Mm-hmm.
And the only body that accounts for that is a human body.
Mm-hmm.
So it's the combination of body and consciousness. And so in Husserl and philosophy generally, phenomenology generally, this is called apperception. Except that if you look up apperception in a dictionary, it'll tell you it's self-awareness.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's what we talked about. That's the child discovering that he or she is different from the parent. That's
Right.
self-awareness.
Mm-hmm.
I have a self and there's the other out there. But Merleau-Ponty is concerned with the next level we went to, which is self-awareness, but as embodied.
Right.
How am I aware of the fact that I have awareness?
Right.
So one of the hallmarks of Merleau-Ponty and French phenomenology is his slogan that all phenomenology is a phenomenology of phenomenology.
Uh-huh.
Whatever domain of awareness you're talking about, The context for that is the self and awareness, and those two are in analogy to each other.
Okay.
Now that makes sense to us because we've already talked about that in terms of memory. One consciousness is the stuff I remember. One consciousness is the stuff that I don't remember, but they're both there.
Mm-hmm.
This is where things like Freud becomes the Freudian description of problems becomes important to Merleau-Ponty, and also to somebody like Foucault. It's how are these things remembered?
Mm-hmm.
And so Merleau-Ponty's version of phenomenology takes it full blown out of philosophy into philosophy and science.
Mm-hmm.
And traditionally within the United States and now generally internationally, we simply call this the philosophy of communication,
Mm-hmm.
because the Husserl-Merleau-Ponty version of all the philosophy is it's a philosophy that accounts for human communication as primary, as the paradigm, the thing that everything else is modeled on.
Mm-hmm.
So animal behavior, machine behavior are all modeled on.
Mm-hmm.
And so one of the interesting things I always used to point out to my undergraduate students is I used to send them over to the library to look up communication in the Encyclopedia of Science and Technology.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know whether I haven't looked at it in years, but the opening line of the entry used to be, communication is an analogy to human conversation.
Mm-hmm.
And then they went on to talk about the machines. So while Merleau-Ponty is doing all of his philosophical work on consciousness, there is a political event that's very important in the development of ideas. The 1960s, called the student riot, the student rebellion of the 1960s.
Mm-hmm.
The rebellion by the students at the Sorbonne, and it was that riot took place politically at the same time there was a very famous congress, the European Congress on Psychology,
Mm-hmm.
and the qualitative psychologists, largely the people, the Freudians and so on, the Lacanians, all of the people who believed in therapy, were revolting against the demand for only statistical studies of psychology, experimental studies, so
Mm-hmm.
that the Congress broke down. They were arguing and stopped talking to each other. In the middle of the Congress, the riots take place. There was a general French social upheaval about really just a great debate between quantitative science and qualitative science. And so the academic version of this shows up in Merleau-Ponty as the confrontation of semiotics and phenomenology.
Mm-hmm.
At that time, semiology and phenomenology. And it was the claim of some of the semioticians, not entirely an accurate claim, but the claim was that language was a pure symbolic form, just like nature.
Right.
That human languages was a phonological system that had nothing to do with human beings. It was simply absorbed by human beings. Well, Merleau-Ponty basically is famous for critiquing that and showing that this wasn't possible. Now, about the same time as that's going on with Merleau-Ponty in France, there's this Russian linguist, Roman Jakobson, who because he's a Russian Jew, he's forced out of Russia, and he takes up residence at the University of Prague.
Mm-hmm.
And he then is heavily influenced by Husserl's logic, and so Roman Jakobson then becomes a kind of phenomenological linguist. And then the next important, I'm just sort of hopscotching through history here. The next important contact is then that the Nazis come to power in Germany, and all of the Jewish scholars emigrate. So Jacobson emigrates to New York. Levi Strauss emigrates out of Paris. Jacobson and Levi Strauss meet each other. So you have Jacobson, the linguist, phenomenologically trained. Levi Strauss, the anthropologist, phenomenologically trained.
Right.
Intimate dialogue partner with Merleau-Ponty in Paris.
Uh-huh.
Levi Strauss, Jacobson spend 3 years together at the New School for Social Research in New York, and the whole phenomenological model of human science evolves, and so the basic methodological logic there of combining the study of human sign systems, basically phonology, and human behavior, anthropology, which are all the template of what Merleau-Ponty has done it theoretically. So
Mm-hmm.
what we have in Levi Strauss and Jacobson are the applied research.
Okay.
Levi Strauss takes it into the study of anthropology and the description of cultures.
Mm-hmm.
Jacobson takes it into language, and he works on the cultural evolution from poetry into prose.
Mm-hmm.
And then the two of them come together because this is nothing but now classical Greek thought.
Mm-hmm.
Because the phonology of Jacobson, the poetry and prose is exactly what the Greeks called mythos, study of myth,
Mm-hmm.
mythos and logos, poetry and prose.
Mm-hmm.
Levi Strauss, on the other hand, doing culture and folk tales, folklore, and so on. That's exactly what the Greeks called magikos.
Mm-hmm.
Magic in Greek means to practice. What are the cultural practices?
Mm-hmm.
So you have magikos. Let's see, I've got mythos and logos, magikos. I'm missing one. I can't think of it.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, it'll come to me in a minute. But anyway, it's just the applied. So it's just the practice. So you have the two of them then a scientific presentation, because on the one hand you have the science of phonology, which is the science of sound,
Mm-hmm.
and the qualitative model that makes sense for it, and you have the cultural model of practice with Levi Strauss, and that makes sense, and the two of them then become a proof. This is almost like the empirical proof for Einstein's theories.
Mm-hmm.
At this point, we have the empirical proof for another person who predicted all of this on theoretical grounds, and that was Ernst Cassirer,
Mm-hmm.
who writes the philosophy of symbolic forms,
Mm-hmm.
which is a phenomenological method. Cassirer predicts that human culture is, we're back to our quadrature now, the differentiation of human culture, self, other, same, different, now has names. It's language, art, myth, and religion.
Mm-hmm.
Language, art, myth, and religion, the quadratic of Aristotle, now is both theoretical. Cassirer goes to great lengths to go through the history of human symbolic systems,
Mm-hmm.
provides a theory. And we have these two latter-day scientists, Levi Strauss and Jacobson, who now provide the empirical examples that Cassirer was correct.
Mm-hmm.
You
It's
see, so
remarkable.
we have a human science model that we can lay out in a chart,
Uh-huh.
moving from eidetic theoretical work to methodology application to empirical results.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely parallel to the same kind of chart we would do for the natural sciences.
Mm-hmm.
So for phenomenologists, Edmund Husserl is like Einstein.
Right.
Edmund Husserl gives us the logic formulas.
Right.
Now, there's a very important footnote here for Americans. everything that Husserl was talking about was being thought of in parallel by Charles Peirce.
Mm-hmm.
Charles Peirce, the American pragmatist. Peirce has this experience as he's going through graduate school. He reads Kant and he says, his impression of Kant is, oh, this is a philosophic theory that can account for practical behavior.
Mm-hmm.
So Peirce sets out to find the way in which logic can be practical.
Mm-hmm.
He ends up reading Husserl.
Mm-hmm.
Peirce reads Husserl's German phenomenology, and we get American semiotics.
Okay.
And so you get somebody like me who says, "My God, we've got two independent thinkers
Mm-hmm.
influenced by the same philosophers. They both read Kant, they both read
Mm-hmm.
Husserl, but we have an American version and a European version."
Right.
So you'll find that most Americans like me who write about European phenomenology always show the parallel to Peirce.
Right.
And most of the American pragmatists who study Peirce, they say, oh, you know what? Look at Husserl here, because
Right.
Peirce actually leaves footnotes. He said, he talks about the great Husserl, the insightful Husserl. He gives little footnotes about where he got the idea.
Right. Well, it's super interesting. Um, I I noticed that a lot of these things are going back to the Greeks. I mean, quite often, as you've been walking us through the
Oh
history and
yeah.
stuff, it's always going back to the Greeks, always going back to Aristotle. That's pretty phenomenal. It's pretty incredible how far ahead they were, or just the ability that they had to be able to think and to come up with these things way back.
Well, one of the interesting things is that they particularly the pre-Socratics, their whole encounter with thinking was their embodiment
Right.
of what they were experiencing around them. And so, I mean, the early, if you read, there are several really good books on early Greek mathematics. And it's always the same kind of narrative allegory, because the descriptions are um, part, yeah, some Greek is out on the seashore and is trying to figure out perspective and starts drawing diagrams in the sand with his finger. Well, what more kind of example do you need than that of embodiment,
Right.
perception turned into experience in the natural world, but with your body. It's
Right.
the finger drawing in the sand that did it, and so that became, this is famous in Peirce. Peirce called that diagrammatic logic. He said all mathematics, all logic goes back to the ability to draw a diagram,
Mm-hmm.
and only a human being draws diagrams.
Right.
Well, I should footnote one thing that's very important that I've left out of the whole story. I've given you the Reader's Digest version, and the big part that I left out, which now responds to the comment you just made,
Mm-hmm.
it goes back to the Greeks, but that's the source of the ideas. But the source of the methodology we owe to the University of Paris, Thomas Aquinas, and Albertus Magnus, Albert the Great.
Mm-hmm.
It's at that period at the University of Paris where they invent the trivium,
Mm-hmm.
three subjects to be taught at the university,
Mm-hmm.
which are logic, rhetoric, and grammar.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what is that? Oh, logic, Aristotle's thinking; rhetoric, Aristotle's speaking;
Mm-hmm.
grammar, Aristotle's writing.
Mm-hmm.
So it's the scholastic philosophers then got into the methodology. What are the three subjects to be taught? And the methodology for teaching those three subjects uh, became the model for the universities. And up until about the mid 1950s, this was also the academic structure of most of the Catholic graduate schools and universities in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
because the requirement there, if you look up some of my articles, I've laid this all out.
Mm-hmm.
They have a pedagogy for the teaching of these things,
Mm-hmm.
and basically it was an incredibly rigorous process in which students were expected to learn to read and write in Greek, read and write in Latin,
Mm-hmm.
and then translate from one to the other in writing and reading.
Mm-hmm.
So each one of those was a stage in development. And so this structure, um, certainly up until World War II, and to a lesser extent afterwards, but up until World War II, this was the absolute structure of the French high schools.
Mm-hmm.
Every high school graduate in France came out with the ability to read and write Greek and Latin.
Mm-hmm.
And you will find this present uh, to a certain degree. It shows forth in Merleau-Ponty. It's the absolute cookie cutter in Foucault.
Mm-hmm.
Foucault he simply finds his own substitute labels.
Right.
But when I read Foucault, the first time I read Foucault, I laughed out loud because I said he just copied his high school notes.
Right. Do you think, let me ask you this question. If you were designing a school, I'm in education, I serve as a head of school. If you were designing a school and a curriculum, what are the things that you would say these are essentials that need to be in a curriculum, maybe at different age levels, elementary, high school, middle school, even that students absolutely be need to be able to understand and learn? What would you put in there?
Well, based on all of my academic political beliefs, I've come to the conclusion that I'm basically a student of Cassira in that I believe the short answer is we have to teach students to be conversant in symbolic forms.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we already believe that in American education. It's the basics. You've got to learn reading and writing,
Mm-hmm.
which is transcription of symbolic forms.
Mm-hmm.
You've got to learn arithmetic. You've got to learn mathematics, which is another symbolic form.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's absolutely essential that we get through the high school curriculum where you get it at least to the level of algebra, because algebra is about the next level. It's the changeover of symbolic systems. Algebra is about converting words and letters into numbers
Mm-hmm.
and vice versa.
Mm-hmm.
So you learn individual symbolic systems. Algebra is the system of systems.
Mm-hmm.
However, that's on the quantitative side. You must
Mm-hmm.
have the qualitative side,
Mm-hmm.
which is literature.
Mm-hmm.
Literature is the imagination. It's the symbolic system used to create imaginary symbolic systems.
Mm-hmm.
So absolutely, reading literature it is essential, because you have to, just like you would be taught algebra, you have to be taught that by a mentor.
Mm-hmm.
Literature has to be taught by a mentor who can guide the discovery of those symbolic forms.
Mm-hmm.
So at least through algebra, and generally most good high schools then go beyond algebra one more level, which then is a three-level system of symbols. Now
Mm-hmm.
that's a fundamental structure, because all logic is a three-level thing.
Mm-hmm.
We're back to Aristotle, the thinking, speaking, writing.
Right.
Those are just logics of levels of logic, and we all know this, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's a fundamental of public speaking that your speech should never have more than 3 points.
Mm-hmm.
Why? Because people stop listening after that. Why? Well, because we know from mathematics, it's at number three where redundancy sets in.
Mm-hmm.
At number three, there's nothing new to learn
Right.
because once you've achieved the symbol of a symbol, that's the fundamental definition of analogy. There
Mm-hmm.
is no more learning. That is
Mm-hmm.
what analogy is.
Mm-hmm.
You can apply it, but you can't expand it. So that's why we have stupid little rules like you. But I remember in grade school, vocabulary building. Repeat a word 3 times and it's yours.
Mm-hmm.
That's a truism.
Right.
It's a common sense truism. Because why? We know this from cognitive science. 3 times is what solidifies the synapses connection.
Right.
We can see it on a graph when
Uh-huh.
it happens. so, so, and then also probably at some point, you kind of have to take the community into account, but at least at high school, there's got to be mandatory foreign language,
Mm-hmm.
and it's got to be practical in the sense that there will always be fundamentals. Now, the fundamentals change. So, for example, I'm almost 80. When I was in high school, the fundamentals were French, Spanish, and German.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, these days, my son, when he went to high school, had the option of Chinese,
Mm-hmm.
those three, and Chinese. So the various schools have various options. But I think we need to take our cue from the international world. And so what would that be? That would be that we're already ahead of the game. English is the #1 language of communication in the world.
Mm-hmm.
Virtually every country has and teaches English as a second language. The great proof of this is news coverage of the war in Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
Every other person in Ukraine speaks English.
Mm-hmm.
Why? Because they've studied it all their life in
Mm-hmm.
school. Okay, so we have English. We should at least have German and French. Why? Because the history of Europe is recorded in those two languages.
Right.
Now, we can get by without French and German if we substitute another language. And this has been the hallmark of Catholic school education. You teach Latin instead.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I went to a relatively severe Catholic high school, so I was taught English, Latin, French, and German.
Man.
Well, those schools are kind of rare these days,
They are.
and they're not required.
Mm-hmm.
They're options.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing that I lament is that during my tenure at Southern Illinois on the graduate faculty, they reached a point where they eliminated the foreign language requirement.
Oh my.
See, and instead you could study statistics. Well, what did that mean? Well, that was a cop out because it meant simply going over to the computer lab and asking the attendant to give you the software for the
Right.
statistics you knew. And you had some classwork where they told you what those statistics did, but you had no working knowledge of the
Right.
statistics. So it was a pointless tool.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas in my case, when I did my doctorate, the minimum was 2 languages.
Right.
So I did French and Spanish because #1, I already spoke Spanish, and French was so close that I didn't have to study very hard.
Well, we call it efficient. You had to get through the program, right?
Well, but my foreign language requirement was on the side. There was no credit for it. Had to take it
Oh,
on your own time.
yeah.
So
Yeah.
when you're counting hours, that's hard.
Yeah, we had so at Duquesne, it was similar. It was either two language proficiencies, or I was fortunate, I was able to do a language proficiency and take phenomenology. They had a course of phenomenology that you had to take through your whole program there. So they consider that a different language. And, quite honestly, it was close for sure.
Well, it's yeah, because it's, well, this is one of the interesting things. Almost all phenomenology is social, so it's German or
Yep.
the transliteration of German. And the thing that is somewhat frightening is that, well, I just wrote an article on Schadenfreude um, as an example.
Mm-hmm.
The frightening thing is that the German is a very close semantic equivalent to Greek.
Mm-hmm.
It's one of the reasons that people like Heidegger are interested in Greek. It
Mm-hmm.
was very easy for him to move from the Greek into German.
Mm-hmm.
The phonological structure of the two languages is very close.
Mm-hmm.
And then the other thing is that unlike German, American English, or just English, British American English, has a syntactical structure that allows a semantic field that is very close to English. So anybody who speaks English, well, finds phenomenology very easy because English has the vocabulary, the lexicon
Mm-hmm.
that allows a precise translation of Merleau-Ponty, Husserl. It's very easy to get into English what they're trying to say.
Right.
This is a particular problem with the French because French vocabulary usually has, you take something like Merleau-Ponty's word sens, and usually translated literally as sense,
Mm-hmm.
but it really has four different meanings
Mm-hmm.
depending on its context.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're not really up on French literature,
Right.
you can't really translate French.
Right.
And Foucault is a devil because he plays on those differences.
Uh-huh.
And a lot of the translations of Foucault are nonsense.
Mm-hmm.
He doesn't say in English what he says in French.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to throw you a curveball here and ask you this
Sure.
question. So I've read a little bit from on the origin of language. Um, and there is, I would say, some debate. Where, from your perspective, does human language originate? How do we get from, how do we get to an actual human language? Symbolic form. What do you have a thought on that?
Oh yeah, yeah. This is one of the problems that's fascinated me my whole life is how do symbolic forms take on meaning? It's usually referred to it by its problematic name, which is the symbolic leap.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it's best to start with an example, which is to say that we know that the language, particularly as a grammatical form, kind of emerged in what is now the Middle Eastern countries.
Mm-hmm.
And we know that one of the monumental symbolic leaps that took place was in farming and in commercial grain sales.
Mm-hmm.
Farmers had to account for the sale of their crops, and so they started off with things like a jar full of grain, a jar full of wheat. You'd sell a jar of wheat, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so we're and what I'm going to talk about in evolution is uh, from a physical thing, one jar of seeds, to its symbolic representation.
Mm-hmm.
Now that move took about roughly 10,000 years. So
Mm-hmm.
symbolic leap is really, really slow, and nobody quite knows what the magic moment is when it happens.
Mm-hmm.
But we do know that it happens.
Mm-hmm.
So the first thing is you got a jar of seeds, you need a record of it. So you mark one on a parchment or a wax tablet.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well that's good for 10 or 15 jars, but it gets kind of cumbersome when you're dealing with a warehouse.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so the first thing that happens is your wax tablet fills up, or the very first system was to tell, I'll use my little bottle cap.
Mm-hmm.
But what they would do is take a piece of clay and put it in, make a ball.
Mm-hmm.
So what one jar of weight was one ball, and you put your little clay ball in another jar.
Mm-hmm.
Get a jar full of balls. Okay, that's the first symbolic move because that little clay ball stood for the jar.
Mm-hmm.
Now that only puts the problem off.
Right.
Now you got a jar full of clay marbles,
Mm-hmm.
and it's better than a warehouse of wheat, but now you got a warehouse full of clay jars. So then somebody says, well, instead of a jar, I'm going to take my little clay marble, but this time I'm going to put a cross on it. I'm going to cut the clay while it's moist so that this jar, this little marble with a slice on it, goes in a new jar. But this represents a jar, this one with a slice represents a jar of 100 marbles.
Mm-hmm.
Ah, okay. The moment they put the slice on the ball, that was the symbol of a symbol.
Mm-hmm.
That's the giant leap forward.
Mm-hmm.
That was the idea of symbolic thinking.
Mm-hmm.
That's where the alphabet came from.
Okay.
Because what happened was, oh, there's a cacophony of sound in nature. Well, we can't use all the sounds of nature, we'll just use a few. So on paper, we would put some marks for some of the sounds. But there's a side story to this now, which is part of your question. So where did they get the idea that there would be a limited number of sounds? That was 10,000 years before the 10,000 years, and that was the age of drums. The first known medium of communication were drums
Mm-hmm.
in Africa, distant drums.
Mm-hmm.
And so drums have a frequency range. And you very quickly get down to a limited number of drum beats and sounds.
Mm-hmm.
So the idea of limited sound, a limited set of sounds, a phonology text, is already in the mind when you're doing marks. So this is just Aristotle again. What
Mm-hmm.
was speaking, drum sounds, becomes writing,
Mm-hmm.
grammar, marks on paper instead of sound.
Mm-hmm.
Don't need the drums anymore. You can simply bring the little marble with a slot on it. So this is
Mm-hmm.
where symbol writing came from.
Mm-hmm.
And then alphabets. And alphabets are embodied because alphabets originally were pictures that people saw.
Mm-hmm.
And so you get there are one of the things about human memory is that there are leftovers.
Mm-hmm.
The one that I usually point out that is still with us in our contemporary alphabet, I usually ask my students, I say, okay, out of all of the letters and sounds in the Roman alphabet, which one's the longest?
Mm-hmm.
The longest letter? What's the longest letter in the written vocabulary?
Mm-hmm.
How can I? So they start writing the alphabet, trying to figure out which one's longest. I said, no, you can only measure longness by sound. You
Mm-hmm.
have to say it A, B, C. Oh, it takes a long time because W is the longest sound
Mm-hmm.
because it's a double U.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, where did W come from? Why isn't one U enough? Single U and W.
Right.
Ah, we're back to differentiation.
Mm-hmm.
Self, other, same, different.
Mm-hmm.
That's a phonological trace from prehistory.
Mm-hmm. Do you feel that people, human beings, let's say, were actually speaking prior to drums? Do you feel there? I mean, where does what is the yeah, how do we get to the point where you get to actually understand the differentiation between different types of sound and actually garner meaning? I mean, I'm assuming that you would say there was communication taking place, meaningful communication before you get to the point where people are making balls or making that jump to symbols.
Yeah.
Is that, am I on the right track there, or am I not making a good assumption?
Oh, you're on the right track. There are kind of two channels. First of all, let me start with which I think is the basic, which is verbal and nonverbal.
Correct.
See, because that's still with us too. That's a primitive notion.
Mm-hmm.
Nonverbal is always first.
Correct.
We always look at nonverbal as the emotional attitude, connotation,
Mm-hmm.
context, frame. When I
Mm-hmm.
look at somebody's face for attitude, that's the frame, and
Mm-hmm.
then I listen to what they're saying.
Right.
So nonverbal sets the frame for how it's going to be decoded. So so if we're talking about primitive human beings, there's a lot of behavior going on, all nonverbal,
Right.
and some of it gets accompanied by sounds. Somebody hits somebody, the person who gets hit makes a sound.
Mm-hmm.
So the gesture and the sound go together. So that's our first primitive symbolic linkage,
Mm-hmm.
because that would be that's one of the first things that a baby learns. Make a sound and be picked up.
Mm-hmm.
Sounds lead to gestures, gestures lead to sounds. Oh, the first differentiation.
Mm-hmm.
So we learned that right away. And this is all speculation because we'll never know.
Right.
But we assume that the limitation starts coming because only some gestures merit a sound. So those must be the important ones
Mm-hmm.
because they have a symbolic function, because we can make the sound without the gesture.
Mm-hmm.
And eventually we know that as talking because we can say something instead of doing it.
Mm-hmm.
But that then leads to our social rule.
Mm-hmm.
Always do the comparison. Somebody says something, watch what they do.
Right.
Watch what they do to see if they say it.
Right. To
You
the
see that
nonverbal.
we just did the adult child, right?
Right.
The adult. Say it, do it. Command from the parent.
Mm-hmm.
Obedience from the child, do it, say it.
Mm-hmm.
How often did your parents say, I want to hear you say it?
Right.
They want you to establish the symbolic rule.
Correct.
So, yeah, I tell you, I'm assuming there was a limitation of practical sounds and gestures that led to a limitation of sounds, which then leads to a selection of a category of combination of sounds. That's the second level symbol thing. Just like gestures can be combined, so can sounds. And so you then get into the whole idea of morpheme, phoneme, single sound, combined sounds, and so on. And then you get again, it's the third level logic. So at some point you have to choose where the sound differentiation is going to go. And so
Mm-hmm.
for example, the easy one is that uh, total languages like Chinese or Dine, the choice is made at the word level. So four
Right.
tones, four sounds. We leave it to the sentence level.
Mm-hmm.
And so it means that it creates a behavioral problem because a Chinese person will associate a single word with your nonverbal,
Mm-hmm.
which to us seems like an instantaneous, imperative uh, command judgment.
Right.
We would call it a harsh judgment
Right.
because we're expecting that judgment to be elongated in time. We have to wait for the whole sentence
Right.
in order to make the nonverbal verbal matchup.
Mm-hmm.
And so a Chinese will tell you that a Westerner can never make up their mind about anything. It takes so long to hear the judgment, the Chinese assume you have no judgment.
Right. Right. Yeah, I'm fascinated by like what is the difference between an animal brain and a human brain that we get language that we I mean obviously we understand that animals communicate, but the fact that I don't know, I did read in one of your articles where you made reference to general semantics, and I believe it was, I don't know if you talked about Korzybski or not, but his idea of time binding, which is something that general semantics talks about, but really recognizing that there's this difference with a human being, that they're able to, that we can get this stuff and bind time and write things on paper and communicate symbolically down through generations and centuries and everything like that.
Uh,
And how I'm just, I've been perplexed on how do we get to that? How does that come about?
okay, yeah, well, that's there's actually the general semantics explanation is pretty good. The general semantics just talks about levels of abstraction,
Mm-hmm.
and usually the general semantics writers get a little bit lost, invariably because they're working only in English, and they're taking English as the example.
Right.
In linguistics, there's a thing called grading:
Mm-hmm.
good, better, best.
Mm-hmm.
The problem is that all languages, because they are symbolic exchange systems, allow for that good, better, best to be infinitely expandable, and which means infinite abstraction. In theory, that's possible, but not for human beings. Remember the three rule, the three levels of logic.
Right.
That's the cutoff point. So abstractions are never going to go beyond a symbol of a symbol.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so let me go back to the good, better, best. So what happens when that's not good enough?
Mm-hmm.
Well, we just we'll combine we'll combine grades. So good, better, best. How about adding on more, most? More good, more better, more best.
Mm-hmm.
Most good.
Mm-hmm.
We can string comparative adjectives together endlessly in English, which
Correct.
is one of the reasons that makes it so flexible.
Yep.
That doesn't get, so the abstraction argument doesn't get us very far. You have to look at it a different way. Abstraction is right in terms of language, but the language itself is a symbolic representation. So, coming back to the question now, animal versus human, the time binding is just a nice name for symbolization.
Uh-huh.
To bind time means to be able to make a symbol.
Mm-hmm.
Space binding is the inability to make a symbol.
Mm-hmm.
So space binding, we know that is for a human being. That's where your body is.
Correct.
Space is divine. This is Merleau-Ponty. Merleau-Ponty says the human conception of space is position.
Mm-hmm.
Where your position is how space is defined,
Right.
especially in terms of what you're able to physically know, see, sense, and not sense.
Mm-hmm.
Anything that you can't sense, you think, you imagine, whatever, in the brain, in consciousness, whatever happens in consciousness, that's time binding,
Mm-hmm.
or what I've called memory.
Right.
So you're in a position, something's happening, and you need to think ahead. My usual example of this is getting out of the room with a door.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, most of us are in a room, the door is closed. I say go out of the room. Well, I used to give this as a problematic to students. I would say we're in a classroom. Describe. I'm from another country. Describe for me how to get out of this room. Describe
Mm-hmm.
in English. What do you do? Well, you go to the door. No, I said, no, you're sitting there. Tell me how. Well, you've got to stand up. You've got to walk to the door. You open the door. And I said, you open the door. How do you open the door?
Mm-hmm.
And they said, with the handle. And I would look over and I would say, but that door doesn't have a handle. It has a knob.
Right.
Whoops, we just had a vocabulary problem.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, which then I would stop them and I would say, okay, we've now discovered that you live in a memory universe. And not only do we live in a memory universe, but you have preferences.
Right.
Some of you are handle people and some of you are knob people. Do you know which one you are? That's sort of like, how do you roll the toilet paper, in
Right.
or out?
Right.
You got to know who you are. I said, for example, know I'm a knob person,
Uh-huh.
and I know why, and we'll find out. So I have people describe. One says, "Well, a knob, you go up and you twist." I said, yeah, one gesture. Handle person. Well, you go up and you have to grab the handle, and I say from the top or bottom. I give them the toilet paper problem.
Mm-hmm.
From the top or the bottom, right-handed or left-handed, because the handle has orientation.
Right.
The knob is universal. So I said, "Oh well, we're all knob people because it's quick." And I said, "No, you're knob people not because it's quick. It's because you've learned to rebel against your parents." What? I said, "You discovered that doorknobs are parents' control devices.
Right.
Doors with knobs cannot be opened by children.
Mm-hmm.
Their body is too small to do it.
Mm-hmm.
But a handle, oh, even your cat can get out of the room with a handle." So I do what Merleau-Ponty would call the Marxist problem on them. It's really about state power and control. Who's in
Right.
charge of this space?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's super interesting. I don't want to take, we've been going for about an hour and 45 minutes, and I haven't even asked you half the questions that I put down on there, but I don't want to take too much of your time today. And I would hope that we could maybe do this again at some point. It's been really fascinating and
Oh,
just
sure. Sure.
a joy to talk to you about all of these things. I've learned a ton, and I appreciate your time today.
Oh, happy to do it. I've always thought that the great challenge for a phenomenologist is to take theoretical ideas and explain ordinary daily behavior.
Hmm.
So
Well,
that,
that's, and I guess that, ultimately that's the point of, the last question I asked, how does this really all relate to the human being? How do we learn about ourselves, and how do we understand better, and how do we live better lives, and learn to communicate better with people? All of these are issues and problems that we're dealing with, and I think the things that you've talked about can give some insight into a lot of that.
well, it all comes down to the Kantian Peircean notions of practicality.
Hmm.
Whatever the academic theory is, it's got to have a practical application in everyday life. And the challenge that I used to give to my colleagues in faculty meetings always was, when we had to make a decision, I would ask them to be as concise as they could about their position, how they would formulate a particular policy. And then to their chagrin, I would always ask, "Okay, that's very clear to me. Can we have a couple of people write that up in language that could be printed into a brochure that could be given to a parent
Hmm.
who comes to ask what their student is studying?"
Hmm.
And the parent opens by saying, "I've come to see what my kid is studying because I pay taxes
Right.
at the state university." So that explanation has to be available.
Right.
Otherwise, it's not practical.
Exactly. Exactly. Well, hey, thanks for being with me today. I'm going to need to
Oh,
get a couple of things from you, a bio. I don't know if you have a bio available, that or something that's been on the back of one of your books or in your articles, and maybe a photograph that I can put up on the website when we publish the podcast.
oh yeah, I have a standard bio paragraph I'll send
Okay.
you.
Hmm.
And
Um, I don't know if I shared my email through academia or not, but I'll put it in there. And if you could get me that, that would be great. I'll send you an email. And hey, been a pleasure, been a joy talking to you. Again,
that's
thanks for taking
fun.
the
I'd like
time.
to do it again.
We'll do it again for sure. I'll be in contact.
Okay, great. Thanks, Jeff.
All right, Dr. Lanigan, have a great day.
Sometimes times the silence speaks when I don't